On the 8th of February 1942, the Japanese attacked Singapore after the successful invasion of Malaya. Over the course of this bloody battle, around 5,000 people were killed or wounded. In the end, the Japanese prevailed in a resounding victory over the British on the 15th of February 1942. However, what it gave way to was even more sinister and terrible. It was the Japanese occupation. The Japanese occupation, lasting between 1942 to 1945, it was a period of intense suffering and hardship. As such, there were innumerable repercussions that befell the people of Singapore, bonding them together yet tearing them apart. Due to the ongoing Second Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese were heavily suspicious of the Chinese population in Singapore, which had sent financial aid to the Chinese soldiers during the aforementioned conflict. Therefore, they were treated brutally by the Japanese. At the Suk Ching Inspection Center at 513 Upper Cross Street. As the plug says, this is one of the centers where the Kempeitai, or the Japanese military police, carried out the identification of alleged members of the overseas Chinese-Japanese resistance. The Suk Ching massacre happened between 18 February and 4 March 1942, in which 70,000 Chinese were killed in the senseless act of cruelty. They also ruthlessly exploited the Chinese population of Singapore. This is exemplified through the Overseas Chinese Association, a group created by the Japanese to use as a platform to exploit the Chinese further. The Japanese demanded that the Chinese leaders give $15 million to them as payment for their anti-Japanese activities. In order to raise enough money, the Overseas Chinese Association decided that all individuals should contribute. Ultimately, there was not enough money raised, causing the association to take a loan from the Japanese Yokohama Specie Bank, causing additional debts to be incurred. Conversely, the Indians were treated much better by the Japanese. The Japanese allowed them to set up their own national army, otherwise known as the INA, in order to let them regain independence from the British, who at the time ruled over India, while also allowing the Japanese to defeat the British once again. The two of them formed an alliance and fought along with the Japanese army. Therefore, it can be seen that the Japanese treated the Indian population of Singapore as their running mate and forged a partnership with them. Despite this, the contrary may sometimes be observed, as the Japanese soldiers sometimes still subjected Indians to lower forms of treatment similar to the Chinese, occasionally massacring them as well. As for how the Japanese treated the Malays, they were treated better than the Chinese and similar to the Indians. The Sultans of Malaya forged a pact and collaborated with the Japanese to retain their rule. Some of the population on the ground also did so, and for those who did not, they were not punished in any way. According to Mr. Abu Bakr in an oral history interview, he said, I quote, "It is common knowledge that the Chinese were the worst to suffer at the hands of the Japanese. The Malays and Indians were hardly touched." Unquote. This, akin to the previously mentioned example, is not completely universal to all Malays as well. Thus, it can be seen that the Japanese treated the three major racial groups extremely differently. This had both an adverse effect on the relations between the aforementioned groups and also managed to bond them together. During the immediate post-war period, after the Japanese surrender and before the British military administration entered Singapore, unfortunately revealed some tension between the different racial groups. An oral history account by Mr. Lee Kip Lin reflects what happened from the time of surrender. Responding to a question of whether he experienced any racial tension, Mr. Lee alluded to the presence of a tenuous rift between the Malays and the Chinese.
And at another point, I saw a crowd, mainly Chinese, trying to ram at the door of a mosque. was a huge pole, banging at the governor's pole, as you would see in American Western films, trying to get to the boss. I didn't believe to see what it is.
An account by Mr. Abu Bakr also echoes similar sentiments. I quote, "Curfew was imposed as Malays and Chinese were fighting one another. There was general distrust between the two communities. Such was the state of the post-war era." End quote. This deep-seated conflict between the Malays and the Chinese immediately after the post-war period also features prominently in Mr. Lee Tian-Su's oral testimony. He said that
the Malays were threatening, and the Chinatown people were waiting to make a counter-attack to the Geylang area.
Lastly, this is also corroborated by Mr. Jojinga Singh recounting of this tumultuous period, where he said that
there was a talk of the Malays in Geylang area arming themselves to fight against the Chinese.
However, the different racial groups displayed a sense of togetherness and unity during the Japanese occupation. Mr. Abu Bakr had personal experience of that. During his oral history interview, he recalled an instance in which, I quote, "My uncle helped a Chinese businessman. That man was eternally grateful for that deed." End quote. This culture of helping one another to get through the tough times represents them putting aside their differences to defeat a common enemy, the Japanese. He also insinuated that, I quote, "At that time, our common enemy was the Japanese. We did not think of hating one another." End quote. Thus, it can be seen that the different racial groups put aside their personal feelings to work towards a common goal, to defeat the Japanese. Further bolstering this is the fact that there are many accounts of people of different races helping one another. Lee Gyok-Boy writes in her book, The Seonan Years, Singapore Under Japanese Rule 1942 to 1945, a story about one Nina Binte Gab and her mother, who managed to save a Chinese friend of Nina's when the Japanese soldiers were searching for young women, again alluding to a spirit of togetherness and camaraderie between the races in the face of a powerful enemy like the Japanese. Ultimately, the Japanese occupation managed to bolster yet fracture the racial tensions between the three main racial groups in Singapore. Truly, this audio demonstrates a significant example of encounter and exchange within our people, and it provides a poignant learning experience for the next generation to not let our divisions fracture us in the face of a strong challenge.